Okay, our next session between here and lunchtime, we've got three very well qualified and experienced speakers talking about what sometimes is a very vexed issue of competition policy in Australia. And I guess it sounds dry in some respects, but when you think about some of the issues that have been at the forefront of public debate around things like retail dominance and even things like the labelling of free-range eggs, they all have aspects of them that are dealt with under the auspices of competition policy. And there is a major review on that has reported, and the government has indicated it's going to do something. And I suspect if you looked at all the promises about what they're going to do, they end up being somewhat self-contradictory. But so our first speaker this morning is probably well known to you by reputation anyway, as either the scourge of the two major retailers or the scourge of poultry producers, depending on which issue you have come into contact with competition policy on. So I don't think he needs any further introduction. Please welcome Rod Sims.
Thank you very much. My voice is not at its best today, which is probably great news for some of the people just mentioned, but we'll see how we go. So look, thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you today. I don't really claim any deep connection to the land, except I used to visit my grandfather's farm in Gellibrand, and back in those days the farm grew just about everything, which is just out of Colac for those who aren't locals. So I can at least claim to be the son of a farmer's daughter, which is pretty close. Obviously we're in the middle of the competition policy review, and that's looking at both competition policy and competition law, and both are very important. So competition policy consists of the measures that governments take to expose markets to competition and remove barriers to making markets work as they should. Excuse me. Competition law establishes the rules of the game, which is what the ACCC enforces. So I'm going to cover three topics today. I'm just going to grab the water first. Sorry about that. I'm first of all going to just talk about some of those competition policy issues. Secondly, I'm going to say a little bit about national champions. I imagine your speaker last night talked about this topic, but I could be wrong. And third, I'd like to spend most time talking about some competition law issues. Now, as part of going to my first topic on competition policy, as part of the Harper Review, we proposed reforms in the areas of privatisation, road transport, shipping and water. I think they are all of great relevance to the farming sector. I'm just going to touch on them lightly today, given the time. With privatisation, we're very strongly in favour of that, but we think privatisation needs to occur in the right way. For example, privatisation should not be driven by budget goals. It should really be driven by getting the appropriate market structure and making sure you've got assets owned by the right parties. And really it'll be farmers and consumers and everybody who pays if indeed we don't get those things right. So when selling ports, we need to ask how we can maximise competition between ports. We need to ask whether we need third-party access regimes, and we need to ask whether monopoly port pricing needs to be regulated. Now, doing each of those things will lower the proceeds you get from sale, but it will mean a much more competitive economy over time. So we're very much urging that when governments, excuse me again, when governments privatise, they do it in the right way. On road transport, I think this is a really important topic and not getting as much focus as it deserves. Current road charging mechanisms and the structural arrangements really are working very badly. First, the prices that are faced by road users don't reflect the costs of using the road, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, and most importantly, there's no link between the prices charged for road users and the revenues received by the road suppliers, and that's the crucial problem. And thirdly, the decisions about funding for investment in roads are often made via political processes rather than independent, sensible analysis. Now, I recently read a news article that illustrated this problem perfectly. And again, I apologise for this voice. I'm hoping it's going to improve as I go, but if it goes the other way, we're all in trouble. Last month, a regional New South Wales council decided not to join a proposed scheme that would have allowed larger trucks on its roads during the upcoming grain harvest. It did that because it had a concern that, of course, it doesn't get the funds to compensate for the road maintenance when the heavy trucks go over the roads. This is a fundamental problem, and road reform can address that. So, likewise, we think road reform can correct some of the or improve some of the landside connections to ports as well. So we have a real disconnect about what roads people are willing to pay for, what roads we get because of the way the system works. Those of you who run diesel trucks understand very well that you're already paying a road user charge. That's exactly what that diesel excise is, and in my view the petrol excise is pretty much the same for motorists. So road user charges don't need to impose any extra burden on anybody. They can just replace the diesel and petrol excise and thereby just get a more effective road system. And I think that reform would be of enormous benefit to everybody. On shipping, about 99% of Australian imports and exports, of course, are transported by sea, and coastal shipping is, of course, a potential alternative to road and rail. Policies which restrict competition in the shipping industry therefore need to be abolished. One example, obviously, is the restrictions on coastal shipping. I think that is a very easy change to make and would be of enormous benefit to just about everybody. And of course, the current exemptions that we have from our cartel laws for liner shipping also should be abolished, and that would benefit importers and exporters as well. So some very easy changes, long overdue, that should be made. Lastly, in the water sector, it's gone through a lot of reforms, and of course they've been controversial. But I think the developments of water markets have helped farmers particularly deal with drought. I think there's scope to extend those reforms, for example, into more rural areas so that we get improved trading between rural and urban regions and between different water users. So I think there's much more to be done in water reform. Now look, I've only touched on those four issues very briefly. My point to you is there's a lot of competition policy going on in this review. I think the farm sector really needs to engage in that, work out what's important to us. We only have these sort of reviews once every 20 years, and I really would urge you to think about what changes you want and keep pressing them forward. Now, my second topic, national champions, I'll deal with that fairly quickly as well. In my view, having governments promote national champions takes us in the opposite direction of making markets work better. It makes them work worse. Now, of course, it's terrific when companies outcompete their rivals and take on the world. That works out very well. The concern is when companies call for restrictions on competition at home so they can compete better on the world stage. The argument to me is a contradiction. If you can't beat your rivals at home, how the hell can you hope to beat them overseas? Interventions by government to restrict competition with the aim of designing some form of ideal market structure are fraught with difficulties. While the intention may be noble, our history tells us that every time government tries to do that, it mucks it up. It was very pleasing, I think, to see the conclusions of the productivity report in its recent inquiry into the costs of doing business in Australia's dairy manufacturing industry. Not just because it had very similar views to what I've just said on national champions, but because it addressed concerns about the economic reasoning of those who support the creation of national champions. And I mean the artificial creation of national champions. Excuse me. A recent study by McKinsey portrayed the New Zealand dairy manufacturing industry as an example where, and I quote, purposeful redesign of the regulation and incentives that shape a market may be required to unlock Australia's potential. They were really advocating that we follow the New Zealand model and that the government create that model. The PC concluded that suggestions that we should follow that structure were based on a simplistic comparison. They glossed over arguments that really underpinned what was going on in New Zealand, and most importantly, they overemphasised the role of planned scale, and I think that's a crucial point. There's been a lot of arguments about the importance of scale with very little evidence to back it up. So the Productivity Commission concluded that the best structure is one that's determined in the marketplace rather than determined by governments. Just thought I'd segue there into wheat. There's been calls to exempt CBH in WA from the provisions of the Wheat Port Mandatory Code. I'm going to talk about that later if my voice holds up. If it doesn't, that's the bit I'm skipping. The idea of exempting them from the code is really based on a national champions argument. But my concern is that that will backfire on farmers. At the moment, CBH only markets half the grain, the other half is marketed by competitors to CBH. And without a proper port access arrangement in place, WA farmers may not have the competition for their grain and will lose out. Okay, let me talk about competition laws. They do set quite broad boundaries for behaviour. Parliament has deliberately designed our competition laws to be broad, to be not that intrusive, and of course that's because when you have intrusive regulation that can stifle innovation and the like. There has to be, though, limits to what companies can do. A market economy only works when companies and individuals pursue the profit motive within certain boundaries. So of course our laws say you can't have cartels, you can't have mergers or agreements which substantially lessen competition, you can't misuse your market power. Now the Harper Review is currently assessing our competition laws. It's recommended a number of changes, and most of which we support, but we've got a few other extra points we're going to be making to them, some of which I'll cover today. Let me first talk about misuse of market power. Now this part of our Act is extremely misunderstood because the title misleads people. Misuse of market power essentially deals with one competitor misusing its market power against its other competitors. It's a competition provision. It's about firms with substantial market power who seek to exclude others from competing with them. It's therefore of very little relevance from a farmer's day-to-day dealings with a buyer of their product, because you're not competing with the person who buys your product. The misuse of market power provision is not relevant. Now we believe the current misuse of market power provision is poorly targeted, it's of limited utility. We say that because it doesn't really deal with exclusionary behaviour that damages the competitive process. Most importantly, it allows firms, and this is the biggest criticism, it allows firms with substantial market power to do any action if a smaller company can do the same thing. And that's a very flawed filter of behaviour of concern, because obviously when big companies do things, it can have profoundly different purposes and effect to when a small company does the same thing. And that's the real problem with why Section 46, as it stands now, is essentially ineffective. Now, the Harper Review is looking to deal with those issues, and it's made a very good start. But I think there are more important provisions that are relevant to the farm sector, and I want to deal with a couple of those. We've got our unconscionable conduct provisions. They really are more relevant in covering dealings between suppliers and buyers. In our view, at the moment, we're we're not arguing for any changes to this section of the Act, but it's going to be very important to see how the courts interpret the Act in terms of some of the actions we have now before the courts. We think unconscionable conduct can be commercially and economically damaging. It creates risks and uncertainty for business. For example, a farmer may be unwilling to invest in their farm if they're concerned that the person who's buying their produce can unilaterally and arbitrarily change the terms of the deal. So we think it does have profound economic consequences. It's important that that sort of behaviour doesn't occur. We think that behaviour is caught by the unconscionable conduct provisions, and some of our current cases will really test whether that's indeed the case. So they are very important. We currently have 10 in-depth unconscionable conduct investigations underway. We have 6 current proceedings in the federal court, and of these, about half of all that relates to business dealings. So we are very well on the way to testing whether these laws work as they should. It's worth noting, though, that not all the complaints one hears about turn into matters where we take action. For example, you would have seen reports in June this year that Ausveg had complained to the ACCC about the conduct of Woolworths in their dealings with fresh produce suppliers and the request by Woolworths for their financial contribution to the Jamie Oliver campaign. The concern was whether suppliers were under pressure to agree. Now, we thoroughly investigated these allegations. We contacted 200 suppliers and we did not receive evidence that they were unfairly pressured. Now, obviously, if we get further evidence, we can relook at it, but at the moment, the evidence we have does not support the allegations made. Now, it's important that we make this public because this issue had a lot of airtime in the media. It also demonstrates that most matters that are raised in the media don't always end up in action, and it also demonstrates the importance of getting evidence. I mean, we work by taking people to court. We need evidence to do that. I want to just talk about collective bargaining, and I'm conscious of time here. This is where I think there are important changes that can be made. And I know you hear a lot about collective bargaining, but I think there's a key improvement that can be made. Now, collective bargaining, as you know, allows farmers, other groups to get together to bargain with perhaps people you're selling to who've got 1 or 2 individual sellers. We believe collective bargaining can generate benefits, but we think there need to be changes. And the key action where we think there needs to be changes is to allow collective boycott action. That's where farmers can legally, collectively withhold their produce from sale until they gain the purchase contract they're satisfied with. Now, currently, involving a case involving chickens some years ago, the tribunal rejected an application involving collective boycott that we had approved. Now, not all applications for collective boycott are appropriate, and some, I understand, question their utility. It's often said to me, look, we can't withhold our milk, it's got to be sold. My point would be the monopoly processor who gets the milk from your region has got to buy milk, so there's pressure on both sides. But I think having the ability to boycott would improve your bargaining position and would help the cohesion of the bargaining group. And I think we could allow more boycott activity if we could have a few changes to the way the notification provisions work. For example, giving the ACCC the ability to impose conditions, giving us a slightly longer assessment period, and giving us a limited stop power, which would be subject to tribunal review. We think if those changes were made, we would be able to deal with more collective boycott applications and the tribunal would let them through. So I would urge you to think about that. We'll be urging the Harper panel to think about that a bit more as well. I've got some other stuff on collective bargaining, but that was the main point. The speech will be up on the website. So I'll save your time and my voice and move on. We think industry codes are very important. This is where there's particular behaviour relevant to a sector. You don't need general laws. Indeed, you don't want general laws dealing with behaviour that's a concern to one sector. So we're very much in favour of industry codes dealing with particular problems. Of course, we've got the franchise code, which has now been strengthened by providing penalties, and it's improved our audit powers to detect breaches. So really this is an important development that's just occurred with the franchising code, and it makes it much more effective. Now, we believe the horticulture code is currently defective and of little use, basically because of the current coverage of the code. We've been advocating changes to that for some time, and hopefully they'll get made in the not too distant future. And of course, we've got discussions over the grocery code. And there may be other areas where you think codes are important. In our submission to the Harper Review, we recommended that codes be considered, but they be drafted so that their provisions are meaningful, enforceable, with penalties for breaches. So we're hoping the franchise code has set the standard for what should be involved with further codes. Just thought I'd talk a bit about competition advocacy. We don't believe that competition issues should just be viewed every 20 years. We think specific problems can arise in particular sectors, and there needs to be a mechanism to address them. And we believe at the moment there isn't. We've recommended that the ACCC have an explicit advocacy role and market studies role, where we can look into issues beyond just deciding whether or not there's a breach of the Act, and decide whether there's a need for government action, a need for some other form of way to deal with it. So that's another important recommendation we've put forward. Just on credence claims, we have put a lot of focus on that. We're focused on what's in the product. We had the Saskia beer matter where there was representations about black pig products, which turned out not to be the case. We focus on where the product's from. So we had the Bass Foods case where they represented that the honey product was from Victoria when it was from Turkey. It also wasn't honey, that's another matter. Don't know why I had that under what's in it rather than where it came from. And more importantly for today, we had the question of how it's made with the Pirovic judgment on free-range eggs. Now, we're writing to egg industry participants this week, drawing their attention to the Pirovic decision. We're encouraging them to consider whether their labelling is appropriate in terms of their claims on free-range eggs. Now, some people have suggested that there's no government standard that producers need to meet to be a free-range producer. Our strong view is there does not need to be a standard. In the Pirovic case, the court ruled that free range means birds can and do go outside on most days. It's therefore up to the producers to determine how they meet this common sense definition. We believe a prescriptive code would require a whole lot of things beyond what are relevant to what consumers understand free range to mean. Look, I'll just make one comment on access to infrastructure very quickly. We think the wheat code is very important. During the development of the wheat code, this is what provides access to wheat ports. There was a lot of debate about whether having a regime to provide access to wheat ports involves just unnecessary regulation. There was a suggestion that port access regulation was inappropriate and constitute an attempt to bring back the single desk, which I think is frankly ridiculous. The wheat code is in fact pro-market, it's not anti-market. It's a necessary part of moving away from the single desk. It's what allows exporters who compete with the port owner to actually also buy the grain from farmers. So we believe an effective functioning wheat port access code is good for farmers. It'll allow more people to buy the product. If you don't have that, the monopoly port owner will of course use their ownership of the port to restrict competition from who can buy your wheat. So look, I'll conclude on that. I think the Harper Review is a very exciting time for us all. I know you have already, but I'd engage you very much, urge you very much to engage with the inquiry, and thank you for your time. I think my voice is getting stronger now, so I'm on a roll. Thank you.